Hello, my name is Kevin Thomas Morgan. I'm a veterinarian, pathologist, and basically a researcher, I guess. This is about my aortic experiences. That started back in 2010. I was in the Lake Placid Ironman. I was extremely well trained. I was ready to get a Kona slot. And I had a big surprise in that race that actually saved my life. So 2010, the Ironman is a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike through the Adirondack Mountains in that case, and a full marathon. I was off the bike 40 minutes ahead of any potential competitor in my age group, which I think was 65 to 69 back then. And 10 miles into the run, I had some really bizarre sensations in the bottom of my feet. It's like the bottom of my feet were on fire. I'd never experienced that before. I was extremely fit. I'd run the Boston Marathon the year before. And it went away if I stopped running. But of course, I was in a race. I was wanting to get a Kona slot. And so I essentially had to kind of run walk for the next 15 miles or so. And at mile 137 in this race, towards the end of the marathon, I was dropped by another guy, Roger, an incredible runner. He'd overtaken my 40-minute gain, and he beat me by about 12 minutes. And so I didn't get the Kona slot. So it might not seem relevant, but it's extremely relevant. So after that race was over, I went and ate a lot of food, and I'm not that much of a competitive person, so I was happy to finish. And Kona no Kona. And so about 10, 12 days later, I'm lying in bed, and I was just wondering what the hell happened in that race. What was that burning sensation in my feet? Unfortunately, I glanced down at my belly, which was moving up and down with my pulse, which at that time was at 38 beats per minute. I was intensely fit. And as a pathologist by training, we study disease. If we see symptoms, the first thing we do is run a differential diagnosis from most likely to least likely. So obviously I did that. My belly is moving up and down. I feel my abdomen, and I feel my pulse in my abdomen feels kind of mushy. I mean, it's hard to reach your aorta, but you can feel mesenteric vessels and stuff like that. There's just like mushy feeling with my pulse. And so first thing I thought was, is this some kind of cancer? I mean, I was 67 years old, and I went through the potential cancers and the way it felt, and dismissed any of them. Next choice would be an abdominal aortic aneurysm. First thing I thought then was basically, shit, I hope I'm wrong. I turned out not to be wrong. I went to see my physician for confirmation. She was disappointing to say the least. I told her the symptoms, and she listened to my abdomen with a stethoscope. Said she couldn't hear anything. She thought I was probably, it was probably no big deal. I was maybe imagining the problem. She literally said that. I said, well, I need a script for a scan. I need an ultrasound. I need to know what's going on. She reluctantly wrote a prescription, kind of implying that I was wasting her time. So I took the script, went over to the facility over the road, an ultrasound facility. It was fortunately right nearby. I went in there, I gave them the script. They booked me in. I waited an hour or so, and then I got an ultrasound run. And after that was over, I came back one day and I get a report, and they said they would inform my doctor, and I would probably hear in the next week or two. I said, that's not good enough. I said, I'm a pathologist by training. I need to see the report, and I need to see it now. I was very insistent. I had to insist. They wanted me to leave. I said, no, I insist on seeing what's being found. And so they allowed me to meet with the radiologist who's seen the scan. He was quite happy to see me. And so he told me, he said, Kevin, you have a 6.9 centimeter AAA, and you need to be extremely careful, and you need to get it treated as soon as possible. By the way, I never heard from that physician of mine ever again, and there was no follow-up, much to my amazement. Well, fortunately, in the neighborhood where I was living, there was a surgeon who I'd spoken to multiple times, and I told him my story, and he said, wait a minute, I can get you in pretty quick. So with his help, we bypassed all the waiting, And where 6.9 is pretty big. I mean, my aorta was pretty close to rupturing. It had survived that race, amazingly enough. Anyway, they get me into the vascular surgery unit. They run an MRI, and I got to see that. And my aortic wall was paper thin, literally paper thin. I mean, the only reason I was there is because I had medical training, or else I would probably been, blithely unaware and carrying on, my usual life. And so they got me in, and they gave me the usual warning, which was didn't need, obviously to avoid trauma to my lower abdomen, and to be extremely careful, including even not to have sex until this was treated. Uh, and so when I came back to the vascular surgeon, they never mentioned an option of open versus EVAR, endovascular, which I think was kind of strange. But I was new to this whole problem. I understood it, but I didn't know what the various treatments were that were available. And so I was in their hands. They put in a Cook Zenith AAA stent graft. And once that was over, which was like minor surgery, really, I mean, it was only in one night. There was it was sore in my left, the region of my left femoral artery. And so I asked the surgeon as I'm being checked out about Ironman. He said he would go easy if he was me, and that was it. So then I went home. I was careful about the use of that leg initially, and then I slowly started getting around with no problems. Everything seemed to be fine. The abdominal pulse, I noticed, had disappeared. I was surprised to see my resting pulse had jumped from 38 up to the high 60s, which was unusual for me. And then 2 weeks later, I go back for a routine checkup, and my blood pressure had jumped from the normal, like 130 over 80. It had jumped to 220 over 120. This is a whole nother story, a long one, I guess. Anyway, so I went to see the surgeon and told him that his stent had induced hypertension, and he said he didn't think it would be that had caused it. No one else had had that experience, and he sent me to see a cardiologist. I saw the cardiologist. He insisted it was nothing to do with the stent, and that I probably had kidney trouble. And I said, well, all your kidney tests are negative. And he said, well, the kidney tests aren't revealing the problem. Well, renal damage is a common cause of hypertension, and clearly the guy couldn't get that out of his head. I said, well, it was triggered by the stent, and Occam's razor says it was the stent. So I talked about medication. He wanted me to go on a beta blocker, which I refused, and we negotiated for me to go on an ACE inhibitor, which worked quite well. So I went home, and I thought, well, I wonder what's causing this. The AAA stent graft is inducing a dangerously high hypertension, 220 over 120. I went online, and within no time, I found in PubMed an article of a researcher in Limerick, Ireland, who predicted this very same thing from rigid, non-compliant stent grafts. And when I think back on this, I mean, these people did a great job, but there was a lot of communication incompetence going on. For instance, when I left after my surgery, I was given no advice on what to do and what not to do, apart from go easy. When I went on to PubMed, I found an article that revealed that 5 people had displacement of their stent grafts by various physical activities, including intense rowing on a rowing machine. And so I substituted the elliptical trainer for that. A Heimlich maneuver. I'm not sure. 2 of the 5 people in the study published years ago had died. None of this was mentioned to me after I left the surgeon's office. So here I am. I'm researching it. I'm changing the way I'm moving, modifying my training. I want to get back into Ironman, but I'm trying to work out, is this safe to do? And so I started after a while, I started a blog, and there's a lot of articles on there. Anyway, so we come back to the hypertension issue. I went on an ACE inhibitor. That helped. I decided it would be good to consult another cardiologist. And now I had the information from the paper in Ireland. So I downloaded it. And this guy had created model aortas, and then he had put in rigid regions distally. I don't know if he'd applied computational fluid dynamics, with which I was extremely familiar. And he predicted that you could get a systolic blood pressure of 220 based upon bounce back waves from the rigid stent graft back to the baroreceptors in the aortic arch. And so that was the postulated mechanism that I remember. That makes sense to me. You hit a rigid area of the airway and it's not of the blood vessel, and it's not elastic, it will change the fluid mechanics dramatically. So I go to another cardiologist and I hand him a copy of the paper and explain what's happening, and told him I think it's a bounce back wave, confusing my baroreceptors. And the second cardiologist said, well, no, you must have a problem with your kidneys. I kind of rolled my eyes and said, well, thank you very much, and took the paper back. I then decided to go and see a third cardiologist over at Duke. I told him my story, and he said I should be on a statin and a beta blocker. And he also mentioned in passing that statins should be put in the drinking water. So I left his office and gave up on cardiologists and decided to work it out for myself. I took the ACE inhibitor. I monitored my blood pressure daily and my pulse, which never came down below. Now it's down in the upper 50s. It's never really come back down to where it was. And I started to live with my stent. I started my blog, Athlete with Stent. I tried to find another Ironman distance triathlete who'd completed an Ironman with a AAA stent graft. I couldn't find one. I never have. And then in 2011, after modifying my training to minimize risk to my stent graft, which included mainly reducing hip flexion and also traumatic damage on really bumpy roads on my bike. I also cut out flip turns where you have you can have really, clear hip flexion where you can bring your knees up to your chest, up to your abdomen. I cut that out. I just use logic. I solved the problem using a technique I called DROS, which is basically you got to get the diagnosis. I had that. You have to do the research to understand your condition, and then you have to question the obvious. Well, obviously you can't do an Ironman or a AAA stent graft because nobody's done that. Well, I proved that isn't correct in 2011. So you question the obvious and then you solve the problem. I did that by modifying my movement, and in 2011, and as far as I know, the only person in the world to do it, I completed a full Ironman in Lake Placid with my AAA stent graft. I was slower, but I came in with not a bad time, 16 hours, feeling good, and you can see that video on YouTube. So basically, by questioning the obvious, I got on with my life. I wrote it up as a small book, which I published, not very well written. It was my first online book. I retired from my science career and decided maybe I could spend my life helping people with these kind of problems. Cook Medical actually sent a video team down and video my life, and I told them my story up until then, and that's in the video which is on YouTube. And so, I get back into training. I can't go quite as fast as I used to because the non-compliant stent graft doesn't allow elastic expansion of the iliac arteries, and therefore I can't get quite as much blood into my legs as I did. So I noticed I lost power on the bike, especially on the bike where you need power. And, everything's fine. Well, in 2013, by some piece of magic, I qualified by being first in my age group in the Raleigh Half Ironman Championship qualifier race in Raleigh, North Carolina. I got the first place in that race in my age group. I guess by then I was, I don't know, maybe 70, I guess. Anyway, and I get to qualify to go to the World's Half Ironman Championships in Las Vegas. Well, that was fine, except in that race, I think around about mile 26, a young guy ran into the back of me. He knocked my rear wheel from under my bike. Remember, this is a half Ironman, which is 1.2 mile swim, 56-mile bike, and a half marathon. So it's a lot easier game than a full by far. Anyway, so I topple to the left and I land my pelvis right on his chain ring. I bounced over to the other side and I tried to save myself with my hands. Big mistake. You should hang on to the bike. Tore up my hands. And unbeknownst to me, in the process, I also subluxated my pelvis, dislocated my pelvis slightly. But most importantly was I dislocated the left arm of my common iliac artery, the left arm of the stent graft out into my aortic aneurysm. I didn't know that, so there was no, obviously the blood was coming out the dislocated stent back into the aneurysm and back down my femoral arteries. I felt nothing. 2 weeks later, I did a half Ironman at the coast with no problems. And then 2 weeks after that, ran about. So now we're talking 2013. I go for my routine AAA stent graft CAT scan with contrast. And there on the Doppler, also there was ultrasound. That's right, it was an ultrasound checkup. If the Doppler showed this bright red patch in the region in my aneurysm, which meant there was a massive endoleak, and the endoleak, of course, was in the left iliac arm flipped back into the aneurysm. Instead of taking the blood down into my common iliac artery, it was once again pressurizing the AAA stent, the aneurysm. So that was kind of interesting. And you can see that red patch on a video, which I incorporated into a video about interviewing my surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. They couldn't fix that problem here at the EVAR unit in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, because the treatment would be to insert another stent up through my femoral artery into my common iliac. But they had to first, in order to hook it up to the left arm of my original Cook Zenith, they had to hook that thing back down and attach it to an inserted stent graft into my common iliac that extended into my left iliac arm, into my common iliac, and down into the femoral artery. There was a fenestration in that additional stent graft, which you can see all this on an image on the video and on some of my lectures and stuff, and on my podcasts, and not podcasts, blogs. Anyway, so then they managed to fix that in Cleveland by remarkable surgery. Tara Mastracci was the surgeon. She was great. So they went in and pulled the left arm back down into the common iliac carefully. That was the dangerous part. And then they attached that to a stent extension that came inside the common iliac and expanded to the wall, which helped stabilized it. And that extension was a short stent, which went down towards the femoral artery. And in it was a little window, a fenestration, lined up exactly with my internal iliac or hypogastric artery. And then they took another stent they hooked up to that, which they installed through my brachial artery in my armpit, down through my aorta, down into the common iliac, branching down into the internal iliac, and hooked it up. How the hell they do that, I have no idea, but they did, and it's been stable, apart from one minor problem in 2017 when it clotted shut. It's been stable ever since, and I'm still using it. It was quite. Tara Mastracci was a great surgeon. When I was lying flat on the table and they were putting in an A-line and all that stuff, and they were ready, she called the whole group together. And it was like incredible piece of equipment in there, and asked me to explain to the team of about 8 people what was going to be done to me. So it was kind of neat. Made me feel like part of the team, which of course they can't do it without me, right? So I leave there. I interview Tara Mastracci, and that interview is on YouTube. The Cleveland Clinic was very strict about what I could ask and what Tara could say, and there was a person there from the Cleveland Clinic, I guess, supervising what was said. Apparently, we didn't break any of the rules, and the interview is up on YouTube. So time goes by and everything's fine. I'm back in training, doing Ironman races, getting older. And in 2017, while I'm training one day, I can't lift my left leg. It doesn't hurt or anything. Everything's fine, but I can't lift it. And that was kind of strange. So I realized there was a problem. So I go back into the vascular unit. They go in, they find that there's been a kink in the inserted correction to my stent graft that's extending down into the common iliac and the internal iliac. It's kinked within the common iliac, causing turbulence, and the whole thing is clotted shut. So now I'm getting blood to my left leg through a few small vessels and I guess any collaterals I've managed to grow in my pelvis. So I go in and I have that fixed by them inserting through my femoral artery another stent within the stent within the stent, which has held it open since then. So from 2017 until now, I'm still training. And in 2014, I started developing signs of peripheral arterial disease, which is a much bigger problem actually for running than the aortic aneurysm has ever been. When I go in, last time I went in for an aorta check, everything seemed fine. The progression of separation of the common iliac, right common iliac, which has started to separate from the wall as the common iliacs have started to swell or become iliac aneurysms. But apparently that hadn't progressed in the previous 2 years, so that seems to be stable. So now my biggest problem is fighting peripheral arterial disease, and I've written a book about that. And I've managed to work around the problems and getting enough blood to my feet, even though it's very, very, very difficult. So now I'm the fortunate owner of a AAA stent graft with an extension into my common iliac and into my internal iliac. And I also have peripheral arterial disease due to a genetic hypertriglyceridemia, fatty blood. All those stories are on my blog and in my books. And now I'm fighting peripheral arterial disease, but I'm 81 years old. I managed to make third place in the world in the half Ironman championships in Finland last fall. I'm going to be competing in the race that qualified me this fall. So if they tell you you can't run with an aortic aneurysm stent graft, don't believe them. If they tell you you can't do the Ironman with an extension of your aortic aneurysm stent graft, don't believe them. And if they tell you you're going to go lift 10 pounds, laugh at them, because that doesn't make any damn sense, because most of us weigh over 10 pounds, as far as I know. And then if they tell you you can't qualify for Ironman races with peripheral arterial disease because it's a progressive disease that stops you from running, don't believe them when they say that either. But say thank you for everything they do. Without the medical profession of the United States, I would have been long dead, partly dependent upon my medical training and also very much dependent upon the remarkable techniques that have been developed in this country. The biggest problem, as far as I can tell, with aortic disease is physicians and surgeons dishing out bad advice to patients. And the problem there is a fiscal one. How do you create a fiscal system that supports both surgeons, physicians, and the people needed to improve people's lifestyle, which is where many of these problems come from? My lipid problem, my blood fat problem, was genetic, but I approached it and solved it. And you know how you solve that? Ironman training put my dyslipidemia back to the normal range. So exercise actually fixed the dyslipidemia that eventually led to my having PAD, peripheral arterial disease. Somehow we have to integrate lifestyle with surgery and pills in a healthy way. And the only way I can think we can do that is to have a Bell Labs approach to the integration of surgery, pills, therapeutic chemicals, and lifestyle changes. It is a serious challenge. And having said all those things, I hope I didn't bore you to death. And thank you very much for your attention.